Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
The World Cup is coming to Qatar this year, but the treatment of its workers could mar the glitter of the games. Welcome to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. Much of the population in the Persian Gulf nation is made up of immigrants, workers who have built some of the most modern buildings amidst the heat of the region. It also reflects a booming international industry of migrant recruitment for jobs. Natasha Iskander is author of a new book entitled Does Skill Make Us Human? Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond. And she takes an intimate look at their lives and the system that entraps them. And we have her on the phone this morning. Welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me, Don.
So one of the first things that popped out at me was the idea that learning is an expression of freedom. Tell me a little bit about that conclusion, that phrase that you use really towards the front of the book.
Yeah, I mean, if you think about learning, you can compel someone to do something. You can force someone to act in a specific way, but you actually can't force someone to learn. Learning requires volition, it requires imagination, it requires desire. It's a really intimate process that occurs within us, but it's also a highly social and connected process. And those connections depend on relationships of trust, where you trust the person who's teaching you, and you reveal to them your vulnerability about what you don't know yet. And so there's something about learning that is really deeply an expression of freedom in the sense that it is a highly volitional and highly human act. So when you deny someone learning, when you deny the fact that they've been in the process of learning, you can very easily slip toward denying that they have the capacity for the registers required for learning. Volition, imagination, desire, intimacy, connection. And then it becomes very easy after that to justify exploitation. And it becomes very easy to slip into regulatory structures of unfreedom.
You seem to indicate that learning is also an expression of social movement. That is to say, if you learn more, then you move up the social ladder, as it were. Obviously, in Qatar, that's not necessarily the case. Tell me a little bit about how that fits into the kind of regulation that they have in the country.
Sure. So, as you noted at the front of this interview, Qatar is hosting the World Cup Games. And when it won the hosting rights in 2010, it poured billions of dollars into the construction of these fantastic, amazing stadia and other infrastructure for the Games. And as it did that, it drew a lot of scrutiny from human rights organizations, from labor groups, and from the international media. And they all pointed to the sponsorship system in Qatar, the regulatory structure that defined how migrant workers were employed and resided in the country. The system is called the kafala system, which actually translates directly into sponsorship. And the employer was the migrant sponsor and controlled everything from their right to be in the country, but also the conditions under which they were in the country. And under this kafala system, for most of the decade leading up to the World Cup, workers were unable to quit their jobs for any reason. They were unable to leave the country at will. And this created a compendium of labor abuses, from wage theft to forced overtime to injury and death, abysmal living conditions in the labor camps in which they were housed, etc. But what was really interesting to me is to note that all workers in Qatar were under the same regulatory structure. So 95% of the workforce in Qatar is migrants, and all 95% of that labor force was covered under this kafala system. So that means that everyone from the street sweeper to the CEO was covered under this regulatory structure. And yet the CEOs, the doctors, the lawyers, they were not experiencing the same kinds of labor abuses. And in Qatar, what turned out was that skill became a really powerful distinction that legitimated the labor abuses of some, in particular workers who were classified as unskilled, regardless of their ability.
Now, you took a visit to one of these facilities that where they're housed, where they live. Describe for me what that was like.
Sure. In fact, I went to more than one. I went to about a dozen. And, they varied. They varied tremendously. There were some that were just abysmal with overflowing toilets, raw sewage in front of them, debris and refuse from construction sites right in the courtyard, men housed 12 to a room on bunk beds in small rooms with air conditioning systems that barely worked, collective kitchens that were small and cramped, toilet facilities that were inadequate. They were really abysmal. On the other end of the spectrum were much more on the surface, better facilities. So you had places where you only had 4 men to a room, where all of the plumbing, kitchen, and entertainment facilities were well stocked and put in place. But what you had in those labor camps was heightened surveillance. So there were cameras on every wall. Access to them was highly difficult. And the worker movements within the labor camps, within these barracks, essentially, were highly regulated.
You mentioned a moment ago in your book that this system is rooted actually, at least in part, with slavery. But now, of course, slavery's been outlawed, but you still have an indebted slavery, as it were. Tell me a little bit about that origin and that transformation that seems to take place. And I will tell you, by the way, that when I was reading it, particularly about the indebted slavery system that seems to exist in the country, it did remind me of the Jim Crow era, in which African Americans, while they were freed, that is, they were no longer slaves, they became indebted and certainly were slaves to the people who they were indebted to. Seems like there's something similar happening here.
Yeah, the tradition or the institutional legacy enshrined in the kafala system has roots in bonded servitude and slavery from the mid-18th century into the early 19th century. And it has, and this is a system that was critical for global commodity production in the region, in particular pearling at the turn of the 19th century. Over time, that institutional structure was reworked and reformatted with oil exploration and natural gas exploration, and redefined in myriad ways. Ultimately, though, the bones of it are still reflected in the kafala system as it was in place during most of the construction for the World Cup. It's important to note here, and I'm sure we'll circle back, that the Qatari government has made significant reforms to this kafala system, which we can argue about whether or not they are they have practicable effects or whether they're just reforms on paper. But in any case, the bones of that structure are still there. An additional layer here is that workers who come to Qatar have to pay recruitment fees to actually get those jobs. Most of these recruitment fees are illegal, both according to Qatari law and according to the laws of countries of origin. Nevertheless, this practice is still very common, and the recruitment fees for a contract in Qatar can range from $500 to $3,500. And for workers who make, on average, between $250 and $350 a month, that is an exorbitant amount. It takes about a year on a 2-year contract to pay back that debt. So you can see how that debt would further tie workers to their employers and make it impossible for them to imagine quitting their jobs, leaving the country with that debt overhanging, especially since many migrants will mortgage family assets to engage in this migration journey.
Matter of fact, I think you have a quote by one of the workers is saying, "My happy day would be the day I leave here." How do they do leave, and I know there is that threat of deportation on the other hand.
Yeah. So workers leave when they finish their contract. It's very unusual for workers to leave of their own volition before their contract is complete. The contracts range from 2 years to 4 years, and in rarer cases, they're longer term, up to a decade or even 15, 16 years. And they return back to their countries of origin. Whether or not they can apply the skills that they have learned to some extent depends on the institutional structures available to them in their home countries, and typically those are weak and underdeveloped. The deportation issue is a significant threat for workers. Workers are deported frequently for very legitimate actions, ranging from protesting not having been paid for weeks or months at a time, to entering spaces in the city, in Doha, that are classified as spaces reserved for skilled workers. Any other kind of minor infraction can lead to immediate deportation. And there's no appeals process. There's no system by which workers can petition for redress. The deportation is very dramatic, very quick, and is a constant threat for workers on these work sites.
Now, you point out in your book that there's this big industry internationally beyond just simply Qatar itself. Basically, I think you use the word selling human bodies, as it were, for whatever particular purpose there is, and particularly influenced oftentimes, I guess, or at least newly emphasized, affected by climate change. Tell me a little bit about that, because it sounds to me as if there's a global shift that's going on, or at least has become more emphasized as we move particularly towards a hotter planet.
Yeah, that's a great question. Qatar, in a way, is a window onto our future. It's a hydrocarbon economy. It's one of the fastest warming places on the planet. And it's also a place where companies are increasingly turning to climate damage as a business resource. So the backdrop for this is that construction companies in Qatar have to ramp up operations very quickly. And for the industry as a whole, this has meant recruiting hundreds of thousands of workers annually and very quickly with very short turnaround times. And so companies are looking for places where they can recruit large numbers of workers very quickly, cheaply. They're looking for workers in bulk. And when I was interviewing them about this challenge, one of the things that was really surprising to me was that they mentioned the value of climate-damaged places as a source for workers, indicating that they were shifting from a strategy of recruiting workers, recruiting labor, to recruiting places. The reason that they found climate-damaged places so attractive was not just that people in those places found that their livelihoods had been decimated by drought or one typhoon after another, or monsoon rains that were fickle and didn't arrive on time or arrived too early. What they were really seeking were places that were newly poor. So what they were looking for is places where that had been wealthy enough to invest in human development, education, health, nutrition, and other human development factors that had seen better days until climate damage, and where climate damage made people desperate for cash to adjust to these climate changes. The reason that newly poor places were attractive is that that's where they could find workers who had developed the capacity that would allow them to learn quickly, right? So they had the literacy, they had the math skills, they had the health, they had the nutritional background that would allow them to be exceptional workers on Qatari construction sites. And firms could get them in bulk and cheaply. And so it was fascinating to me, because what I found was that companies in Qatar had highly granular understandings and information about climate damage in places all around the world, from Mozambique to Nepal, and not just by country, but by specific region, with a deep understanding of the ways that climate change had stressed the livelihoods of people in particular places.
Now, you mentioned that this idea that they also look upon workers from different places with having different particular skills or particular dispositions, and looking at not only them as groups, but also as simply individual commodities.
That's right. So what was really fascinating to me was that on these construction sites, they were a little bit like Roman armies. They had workers from all around the world. In fact, one construction site I went to, one of the managers had a side hobby of tallying the number of languages on site, and he calculated on this site of 8,000 men that there were 22 languages spoken, which shows you something about the kind of ethnic and national diversity on site. But one of the pernicious expressions of this, or one of the pernicious effects of this national diversity, was that managers categorized workers by their national origin and attached to those categories qualities or propensities. So, for example, on some sites, Nepali workers were categorized as being exceptional scaffolders. And the argument here was that they live in a mountainous country and so are comfortable with heights and are fearless. On other sites, Nepali workers were categorized as docile, slow, lacking capacity, easy to bully, can do the worst work, the most dehumanizing work without complaint. On some sites, Ethiopian workers were described as resistant to the heat, and as a result were not given protective equipment to handle hot metal that had heated up in the heat of the day. Were given just very thin fabric gloves, and when I interviewed workers, I noticed that their hands were actually peeling as a result of burn scars. So these national categories became vehicles for commodification of workers. Workers became like labor inputs, similar to timber or a brand of concrete or a particular kind of masonry. They weren't understood through these national lenses as workers who could learn, who could develop expertise, who took pride in their work, who required courage, who engaged in the social connections necessary for learning and the development of expertise. They just became commodities that could be applied to different projects as necessary.
Now you mentioned
and interchangeable.
Now you mentioned, by the way, the fact that there have been protests, and also the idea that the managers tend to manage protests. Tell me a little bit about that and the human capacity to at least recognize that there's an issue here, that they do push back, even sometimes across ethnic lines.
Yeah. So one of the fascinating things is, even though protest is illegal in Qatar, and any kind of labor organizing is illegal for migrant workers in Qatar, so no collective organizing, no union representation. There is a very inaccessible complaint mechanism in which workers can file formal complaints with the Ministry of Labor, but that is all but ineffective for workers. And workers endure, as I mentioned, periodic moments of significant labor abuse. So chronic wage theft, forced overtime, forced to work in unsafe conditions. And what I found was that on construction sites, it was very common for workers to engage in wildcat strikes. The definition of wildcat strikes are strikes that are spontaneous, not attached to formal labor organizations, of which none existed in Qatar, but workers would strike very frequently. And the health and safety staff on construction sites viewed the management of these wildcat strikes as part of their jobs. So, they would talk about the fact that these strikes were a way for workers to blow off steam, or a way for them to just take a rest, and that you just had to give them a couple of days and then get them back on the site. And as long as these protests were confined to the labor camps, they could be allowed to take a day or two to get their heads back on straight, as the health and safety staff might have described it. But there were parameters around these strikes. So strikes that were confined to people of a single nationality were allowed. The minute that these strikes crossed national lines, where Thai workers, for example, organized with Ethiopian workers, or Nepali workers organized with Filipino workers, then this became a threat to companies, because workers were no longer blowing off steam as part of their national category. They were creating a class identity, an identity as workers against management excesses in terms of labor violations. And that was perceived as enormously threatening and led to immediate deportation. So while you had strikes, they were, stage managed, curated by management. Only certain types of strikes were allowed, and others would result in immediate deportation. So against this backdrop, where protest was virtually impossible, meaningful protests to change conditions on site was virtually impossible, workers found other ways to resist. And one of the more powerful ways that I observed workers resisting was a skill-based strategy of resistance, where the practices of learning and the practices of expertise development, the social relationships involved in that, became a way for workers to develop ties of solidarity. And in fact, workers described one another with kin terms, right? So this is my uncle, my little brother, my big brother, who's teaching me how to create this scaffolding structure. And these ties across nationality that were trade-based, right? So identities as scaffolders rather than Nepalis and Indian and Ghanaian, right? They were identities as scaffolders, allowed them to push back on management requirements that violated what they understood to be safe practice based on their expertise. So to give you an example, on one site, the scaffolders pushed back against, forced overtime that would have required them to work at night and work 16-hour shifts. And they said that it was impossible to work safely at night at the pace they were required to work, because the lighting cast shadows that were confusing when they were working at height. And so based on their ability, based on their expertise, they refused to work at night. And all of the scaffolders across nationality refused to work at night. And management had to back down.
You mentioned a moment ago, by the way, about the working conditions. And I know one of the key elements, obviously, in Qatar has been the heat. Matter of fact, you took your own trip up one of these high rises. Tell me then a little bit about what that experience was like, because when we're in heat of some kind, with a desert or whatever, it can be really debilitating. I cannot imagine what the temperatures would be when you're up there working. What was your experience like?
So I was on scaffolds and on these construction sites a lot. I spent hundreds of hours shadowing workers. And I was frequently up on scaffolds, many, many stories up in the air. And the thing about heat stroke and heat injury is that you can be fine in the heat one day, and then another day you can be completely debilitated by it. It is a capricious injury. It comes unannounced. You think you're fine, and then you're not. And one of the more dangerous aspects of early heat injury before it becomes extreme is confusion and loss of orientation on site. And so what can start to happen is that you become unable to enact safety practices. So the day that I had heat stroke, it wasn't a particularly hot day. It wasn't a day where the heat temperatures were at danger levels. There are days in which the heat is so high that you can only work 15 minutes out of every hour, and you need to drink 4 cups of water during that hour just to cope with the heat. But that day was a day that was hot but not dangerous, and yet I developed heat stroke and immediately felt like I had to remove my safety harness, that my life depended on my removing my safety harness. I was disoriented. I couldn't locate where different sounds were coming from. I was off balance. And in fact, I am sure that I would have sustained an injury had it not been for the awareness of the workers around me, who immediately noticed that I was suffering from heat stress and sat me down and gave me water. And this was a really eye-opening experience for me because for 2 reasons. First, it was amazing how attuned workers were to each other's expressions of stress and how careful they were about responding to early signs of heat stress. There's a lot of press coverage at the rates of death and injury on Qatari work sites. The Guardian has estimated that 6,500 workers have died in the construction of the World Cup facilities. But for me, the really important question is, why have not more workers died? And the answer to that question, died or been injured, the answer to that question is without a doubt the care that workers exercise in noticing early signs of injury and disorientation amongst one another. It's the worker care and expertise here that plays a huge role. The other really significant piece for me about heat stress, my own experience of heat stress, was how difficult it is to talk about, how it fills one with a sense of, not to be overdramatic, but it fills one with a sense of shame, right? That you suddenly lost your ability to manage, to access your own cognition. And that is one of the reasons, I think, that workers are loath to discuss it. They will describe heat as the most difficult part of their job. They describe the heat as a wall pressing down on them, or that they're drowning in the air. But they will rarely discuss moments when they have experienced heat stress. And in fact, I don't think it's an overstatement to say that basically all workers have, to one degree or another, experienced mild all the way through life-threatening heat stress.
So what has been the response in terms of the human rights community? Any pressure to reform any of this? Or is it just that we're going to roll on through the rest of the year and get the games?
So one of the interesting things about the World Cup is that it's shown a light onto these labor abuses. And Qatar has very lately instituted a set of reforms to allow workers to quit their jobs, to leave the country at will, and some measures to try and curb wage theft. How effective these measures are is highly debatable. To quit your job, you have to go through a series of steps that make it almost impossible to do so. Changing jobs is very difficult when you can't actually move easily in the city to look for another job. Right? So all of these things make these reforms look more promising on paper than in practice. But on paper, the Qatari regulatory system now looks more protective than our H visas here in the U.S. In the U.S., workers on an H-1B, H-2A, H-2B, these are foreign worker visas, do not have the ability to change jobs. And if they quit their job, they need to leave the country immediately, within 2 weeks. And so you can see how this international press has created something of a momentum to amend this regulatory structure that had been really confining and tantamount to bonded labor. There have also been some moves to protect workers against heat stroke. Although, like I said, the heat stroke is a capricious danger, and it doesn't only present a danger to workers when temperatures are extreme. But these conversations about improving labor rights, the fact that they're attached to a global sporting event, I think is very promising. The next World Cup in 2026 will be held in the U.S., Canada, and Mexico. And the most hopeful outcome of this World Cup in Qatar might very well be the continuation of global conversations about labor rights in the U.S., Mexico, and Canada when we host the Games, and revisiting and a reexamination of some of our labor practices, and real discussions about how to ensure that workers are remunerated and acknowledged for their tremendous contribution to making sporting events like these happen.
We've been talking with Natasha Iskander. She's author of a new book entitled Does Skill Make Us Human? Migrant Workers in 21st Century Qatar and Beyond. And we appreciate the fact that you took time to talk with us this morning.
Thank you so much for having me.
This has been Delmarva Today. I'm Don Rush. Thanks for listening. Delmarva Today with Don Rush.